Earth had been a member of the Galactic Assembly for 30 years, and in those 30 years had managed to be almost completely forgettable. That is not a harsh assessment. It is simply an accurate one. The Assembly contained hundreds of member species at various stages of development and influence, and the reality of any large institution is that most of its members occupy the middle and lower tiers of visibility, present and participating, but not shaping the room. Earth was not the newest member and not the least developed and not the smallest delegation, but it had never done anything in 3 decades that pushed it out of the comfortable anonymity of the middle tier and into the kind of prominence that other species remembered and talked about and factored into their calculations. Humanity attended every session. That part was notable in its consistency, if nothing else. Perfect attendance across 30 years of assembly meetings, which required a genuine organizational commitment given the distances and scheduling complexities involved. They voted in every procedural matter, always on time, always correctly formatted, never abstaining on the administrative votes the way some delegations did when they could not be bothered to take a position on something that did not directly affect them. They paid every dues assessment before the deadline. They followed every rule and met every obligation and filed every required report and did it all with a quiet thoroughness that the Assembly's administrative staff appreciated enormously, even if the other delegations barely noticed it. What they did not do was talk very much, not in any way that mattered at the political level. Human delegates spoke in sessions when procedural requirements called for it. They asked questions occasionally. Good questions, actually, the kind that cut to something real, without wasting anyone's time. But they did not make speeches, and they did not grandstand, and they did not position themselves as voices on the major issues of the day the way ambitious delegations did when they were trying to build influence and reputation. They sat in the mid-left section of the chamber, a modest group at modest desks, and they watched, and they listened, and they participated minimally, and nobody thought very hard about why. The other species in the assembly had various theories about humanity's quietness when they thought about it all. The most common was simply that Earth was a young member still finding its feet, deferring to more established voices, while it built its understanding of how the institution worked. Another was that human political culture was internally focused, more concerned with its own planetary affairs than with the broader galactic picture. A few more cynical observers suggested that Earth was simply not very capable and had learned to stay quiet to avoid exposing that limitation. Nobody considered the possibility that the quietness was deliberate. Nobody considered that 30 years of unremarkable attendance and minimal participation might be 30 years of something else entirely, running underneath the surface where the Assembly's attention never quite reached. Human Representative Walter Greer had occupied the senior delegate position for 8 of those 30 years. He was a gray-haired man in his early 60s with the patient face of someone who had spent a long career being underestimated and had long since stopped finding it inconvenient. He dressed plainly and spoke rarely and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have nothing to prove in any given room because they have already proved whatever they needed to prove somewhere else. The other delegates knew him the way you know a piece of furniture you have stopped seeing. Present, consistent, part of the background. He stood up on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a routine session that had been moving through an agenda with the usual combination of procedural efficiency and political friction, and asked to address the chamber. The session chair recognized him because the session chair recognized everyone. That was procedure. You did not evaluate the request before granting it. You granted it, and then you found out what the requester had to say. Walter stood. He did not clear his throat. He did not arrange his notes or consult a prepared text. He stood with a straightforward posture of someone who knew what they wanted to say and had decided how to say it, and did not need any of the usual performance, scaffolding that surrounded formal addresses in large political chambers. He looked across the chamber at the Vorkan delegation. The Vorkan Empire had been a significant presence in the assembly for several hundred years. Large, well-organized, experienced in particular arts of galactic politics that took centuries to develop. Their delegation occupied a prominent section of the chamber, and their ambassador, a senior diplomat named Drell, was known as one of the shrewdest political operators in the institution. Walter addressed him directly rather than speaking to the chamber generally. He said that Earth had received intelligence reports indicating the Vorkan Empire was currently massing a fleet near the independent colony worlds in Sector 7. He said Earth was formally requesting that the Vorkan Empire stand down and withdraw those fleet assets immediately. He said that if the Vorkan Empire proceeded with what the fleet positioning suggested, Earth would respond. He sat back down. The whole address had taken less than 90 seconds. The chamber was quiet for a moment after he sat down, the specific quality of quiet that follows something unexpected in a room full of experienced political operators who are rapidly assessing what they just heard and what it means. Then the murmuring began. Not hostile murmuring, not alarmed murmuring. The kind of murmuring that moves through a room when something slightly awkward has happened, and everyone is choosing to be gracious about it. Quiet conversations between delegates and their aides, a few glances exchanged across the chamber. The general soft noise of an institution recalibrating around a minor interruption to its proceedings. The Vorkan ambassador, Drell, looked across the chamber at Walter Greer with an expression that had been carefully constructed to show nothing in particular. He was too experienced a diplomat to let his actual reaction reach his face in a public setting. What his actual reaction was the very slight incredulity of a powerful political figure being formally warned by a species that had spent 30 years being invisible. He kept entirely internal. He said nothing. The session chair moved the agenda forward. Walter Greer opened his notebook and wrote a brief note in it, and otherwise returned to background where it had always been, unremarkable and patient and quiet, watching the session continue around him with the unhurried attention of someone who has said what needed saying and is content to wait for what comes next. After the session concluded, Ambassador Drell drafted a message to Vorkan High Command from his private communication suite. He kept it short because there was not much to say. The situation did not seem to require extensive analysis. It read, "Earth issued us a warning today. I thought you should know. I did not think you needed to worry." He reviewed it briefly, decided it accurately captured the situation, and sent it. Then he moved on to his other correspondence. He had considerably more pressing matters on his schedule. An Earth warning did not rank among them. The meeting was called for 0800 hours the following morning, and Fleet Admiral Kovith arrived early. This was not unusual. Kovith was always early to meetings he ran, because arriving first gave him time to read the room before anyone else was in it, to set the physical and psychological tone of the space before the dynamics of the gathering began. He had been running strategic planning sessions for the Vorkan High Command for 22 years, and he had long since developed the habits that made him effective at it. Arriving early was one of them. He reviewed his materials while the chamber filled. The intelligence files on Earth, the current fleet positioning data from Sector 7, the draft diplomatic response that his communications team had prepared overnight for the Council's consideration, the agenda for the session, which he had structured to move efficiently from assessment to decision because he did not expect this particular matter to require extended deliberation. Earth's warning was an official assembly communication and required an official response. That was the primary reason the full Strategic Planning Council had been assembled rather than handling it through a smaller working group. The formality of the warning's channel demanded a formality of response. But the substance of the warning, the actual military and strategic question of whether Earth could do what it had implied it would do, Kovith expected to be resolved quickly. The Council assembled at 0800. 12 senior officers and 3 intelligence analysts taking their seats around a long table in the order established by rank and seniority. Kovith watched them settle and assess the mood. Professional, alert, no one visibly concerned, which matched his own assessment of the situation. He opened the meeting and gave the floor to the Intelligence Division first. Standard procedure. You assess before you decided. You let the analysts lay out what was known before the military officers began interpreting it. The lead analyst, a senior officer named Reth who had been with the Intelligence Division for 30 years and had a reputation for methodical thoroughness, presented the Earth file with the organized efficiency of someone who had spent the previous evening making sure his materials were comprehensive and his conclusions were supportable. The presentation took 20 minutes. The picture it painted was consistent across every category of assessment. Earth's military profile over 30 years of assembly membership showed no offensive engagements of any kind, no power projection beyond their home system, no deployment of military assets to support political positions in assembly debates or disputes involving other species. No publicly visible military infrastructure of any significant scale beyond a basic defensive capability that even the most peacefully inclined spacefaring species maintained as a minimum. Technology assessments placed Earth at a level consistent with their 30-year membership history, early to mid-stage spacefaring development, capable in the areas directly related to their own system's operation and transportation, but not showing the kind of technological advancement that preceded serious military power projection. The assessments have been updated regularly, and the trend line was unremarkable. Nothing in 30 years of data suggested Earth had the capability to back up the warning it had issued. Ref concluded his presentation and remained standing for questions. The questions from the senior officers were thorough, and Ref answered them thoroughly. Hull counts on known Earth vessels, energy output readings from Earth system installations, known weapons development programs. Each answer consistent with the profile the presentation had established. Then the younger analyst spoke. His name was Fun, and he was the most junior person in the room by both age and rank, present because he had been assigned to the Earth file specifically for the last 2 years and had developed a more detailed working knowledge of it than anyone else on the team. He had been sitting quietly through presentation and the questions, and Kovith had noted him as the kind of young officer who waited until he had something worth saying before opening his mouth. Fun raised his hand, and Kovith gave him the floor. "I want to add one thing to the assessment," Fun said. His voice was careful in a way that junior officers are careful when speaking in a room full of people who outrank them significantly. Not hesitant, careful, choosing his words with the attention of someone who wants to be heard accurately. "Our intelligence on Earth is good on what they have shown publicly. 30 years of observation through assembly channels and standard monitoring gives us a solid picture of their visible profile." He paused. "What we don't have," he continued, "is good intelligence on what they have chosen not to show publicly. The Earth file is built on observable data. Earth has been unusually quiet for 30 years. Quieter than other species at comparable development stages. Quieter than the assembly membership norms would predict for a species building its institutional presence." He looked at his materials and then at the council. That quietness could mean they have nothing worth showing. That is the most straightforward interpretation, and probably the correct one. Another pause, shorter, but it could mean something else. 30 years is a long time to be quiet. The chamber was still for a moment after he finished. Kovith looked at Fun with the expression of a senior officer assessing a junior one. "Could mean something else is not an operational assessment," he said. His tone was not unkind. It was the tone of a man clarifying the standards that applied in this room. "I cannot build a strategy around a possibility you cannot quantify or support with data." Fun met his eyes steadily. "No, sir," he said. "It is not. I understand." He sat down. The debate that followed was substantive in the way that good strategic planning debates were substantive. Officers with different perspectives and different areas of expertise stress testing the assessment from multiple angles, looking for weaknesses in the conclusion that the data supported. Several officers pushed on the technology assessment, asking whether Earth might have development programs that the monitoring had missed. Ref answered those questions with the confidence of someone who had considered them already. The monitoring was comprehensive. The assessment was solid. One officer asked about Earth's motivation for issuing a warning it could not back up. What was the political calculation? What did Earth gain from an empty warning that everyone in the assembly would recognize as empty? This generated the most discussion. Nobody had a fully satisfying answer. The most common interpretation was that Earth was posturing, using the assembly's formal channels to signal general opposition to Vorkan expansion, even without the capability to act on it. Species did this. They staked out positions for political reasons, even when the positions outpaced their actual capability. It was not unusual behavior for a developing assembly member trying to build a reputation as a principled voice. The debate ran for 40 minutes. When Kovith called the vote, it was unanimous. Earth was bluffing. The logic was straightforward, and everyone around the table had arrived at it independently before the vote was called. Species that possessed real military capability did not spend 30 years being invisible. Power advertised itself. It found ways to be known even when it was not being actively demonstrated, because known power served political purposes that invisible power could not serve. If Earth had something significant behind its warning, They would have found reasons to suggest its existence over 3 decades of assembly membership. They had suggested nothing. They had nothing. The fleet deployment in Sector 7 would proceed as planned. The diplomatic reply to Earth was the last item on the agenda. The communications officer had prepared a draft that was reviewed around the table and approved with minor adjustments in under 10 minutes. It was polite and formal and precisely calibrated in the way that experienced diplomatic communications were calibrated, acknowledging Earth's concern as a matter of courtesy, making clear the Vorkan Empire's intentions without being aggressive about it, leaving a door open for a further discussion that everyone understood would not be walked through. It was a reply designed to close a matter rather than continue it. Kovith read the final version once. It said what it needed to say. Nothing more, nothing less. He picked up his authorization stylus and signed it at the bottom with the efficient motion of a man completing a minor administrative task before moving on to the rest of his day. The meeting was adjourned. The senior officers filed out discussing other matters, the Sector 7 deployment logistics, the schedule for the next planning cycle, the routine operational business of a large military command. The Earth file was closed and returned to the Intelligence Division's archive, where it would be updated with the morning's decision and filed for future reference. Flynn gathered his materials last, moving without hurry, and walked out of the chamber behind the senior officers. He did not say anything else. He had said what he had to say, and it had not changed the outcome, and he understood why it had not changed the outcome, because the data genuinely did not support a different conclusion. He just could not entirely shake the feeling about 30 years of quiet. He filed it away and moved on. Behind him in the chamber, the documents were cleared from the table, and the lights were set to stand by, and the room returned to the neutral readiness of a space waiting for its next use. Admiral Kovith had already moved on to the next item on his schedule. He never read another document again. The Vorkan reply arrived in Earth's secure diplomatic inbox at 0547 hours and was flagged immediately by the overnight duty officer and routed to Admiral at Briggs's personal queue with the priority designation that all Vorkan communications had carried since the intelligence reports about Sector 7 first came in 3 weeks ago. That was already at her desk when it arrived. She was almost always at her desk before the building's day shift began. It was a habit built over 31 years of military service, the product of a career spent in roles where the information that arrived in the early morning hours before the institutional day officially started was often the most important information of the day. Decisions got made in the small hours. Events happened while large organizations were transitioning between shifts. The early morning was when you found out what the night had produced. She read the Vorkan reply once, straight through, without stopping. It was well written. She gave them that. Whoever had drafted it had done the work carefully, choosing language that was simultaneously firm and polite in a way that experienced diplomatic communications managed to be both things at once without the tension between them becoming visible. It acknowledged Earth's communication through the assembly. It expressed the Vorkan Empire's appreciation for Earth's concern regarding stability in Sector 7. It outlined the Vorkan Empire's position on the matter in language that was clear without being aggressive. It made absolutely no indication of any intention to change course. She set it down on her desk. She looked at the tactical display that covered most of the wall to her left, a real-time feed from Earth's monitoring network showing the current position and projected movement of the Vorkan fleet in Sector 7. The fleet had been massing for 11 days. It was large, well organized, moving with the deliberate patience of a military force that was not rushing because it did not need to rush, that had done its planning and was now executing with the confidence of commanders who expected no serious opposition. The projected advance line on the display reached the nearest colony world in approximately 60 hours. I sat at her desk and looked at the display for a moment. She thought about Walter Greer standing up in the assembly chamber yesterday afternoon. She had watched the session feed in real time from this room, had seen his 90-second address and the murmuring that followed it and the Vorkan ambassador's carefully neutral expression. She had talked with Walter afterward through a secure channel, and he had described the room's reaction with the understated precision he brought to everything. Nobody took it seriously, he had said. She had expected that. They had both expected that. The warning had not been issued because they expected the Vorkan Empire to comply with it. The warning had been issued because the situation required that a warning be given before a response was made, that the records show clearly that Earth had communicated its position through official channels and had been ignored, that what came next could not be characterized as unprovoked. The warning had served its purpose. Now she picked up the Vorkan reply and placed it in the documentation file that would form part of that record, and she turned her full attention to the tactical display. Then she opened the channel. It was not on any standard military communication system. It did not appear in any directory or network map that the Assembly's monitoring infrastructure could detect. It had been built over 20 years by a team of engineers who had understood from the beginning that its existence was the one piece of information that could never be allowed to reach the Assembly's general awareness, and they had built accordingly. The physical infrastructure was distributed across installations that had no obvious military appearance. The encryption was layered in ways that would require years to unravel, even by the most sophisticated signals intelligence operations the Assembly had access to. It had a dedicated authorization code that could only be activated by 5 people on Earth, each of whom held a fragment of the complete code that was useless without the others, that held her fragment and transmitted it. Within 60 seconds, the other 4 fragments arrived from the other 4 holders, each of them having received the same signal she had sent when she activated her fragment, and each of them responding with the speed of people who had been waiting for this moment and were ready for it. The authentication sequence ran. Signals Officer Pete Garland was at his station on the far side of the command center, a position he had occupied for 6 months without ever having witnessed the Admiral do what she was doing right now. He was 24 years old, and he was good at his job, and he had been selected for this posting partly because his clearance profile suggested he could handle unusual information without losing his professional composure. His professional composure was being tested. He watched the authentication sequence complete with a focused attention of someone who understands they are watching something significant and does not want to miss any of it. He watched confirmation codes arrive on the Admiral's screen from sources that his own access level could see existed but could not identify, locations that appear in the network as verified nodes without names or coordinates attached, presences without addresses. Then the channel established, and things came online. Pete looked at his screen. He was a signals officer. His entire professional framework was built around understanding communication networks, knowing what different signal types meant, being able to read the technical architecture of a communication system and understand what it represented in operational terms. He had studied military communications for 6 years before joining the service, and had spent 6 years in the service developing that foundation into operational expertise. He looked at what had just come online on his screen, and he understood what he was looking at. He sat very still, not frozen, not incapacitated, just very still in a way that people go still when they encounter something that requires their complete attention, and any movement would be a distraction from the processing that needed to happen. He looked at his screen for a long moment. Then he looked at Admiral Briggs. She was working at her own station with the calm, focused efficiency she always brought to operational work, pulling up data from a newly established channel, cross-referencing it with the tactical display, doing the work of a commander integrating new information into an existing operational picture. She did not look back at him. She was busy. He looked back at his screen. He thought about 30 years. He had joined the service 4 years ago at 20 and had grown up knowing that Earth was a member of the Galactic Assembly and that Earth's Assembly membership had been quiet and unremarkable and that this was simply the nature of Earth's place in the galactic community. A developing species finding its feet, present and participating, but not yet significant. He thought about the warning Walter Greer had delivered yesterday afternoon in 90 seconds. He thought about the Vorkan ambassador's carefully neutral expression. He thought about the murmuring of a chamber that was being politely gracious about something slightly embarrassing. He thought about the channel that had just opened and what it had brought online. He thought about 30 years of dues paid on time and procedural votes filed correctly and sessions attended without fail, and nothing said that anyone remembered. He thought about what 30 years of that looked like from inside a chamber full of species who had stopped paying attention. And then he thought about what 30 years of that looked like when you were on the inside, and you knew what was being built underneath the unremarkable surface, and you had just watched it come fully online for the first time in response to a fleet that had read a warning and decided it was empty. He finally understood, not just intellectually. He had understood it intellectually in fragments over 6 months of working in this building. He understood it now the way you understand something when the full picture assembles itself in front of you and the pieces that had been separate suddenly resolve into a single coherent image. 30 years of quiet was not the absence of preparation. It was the preparation itself. Admiral Briggs spoke without looking up from her work. "Mr. Garland," she said. Her voice was the same voice she always used. Level and unhurried and completely matter-of-fact. "I need the Sector 7 tracking feeds integrated into the primary display in the next 10 minutes. Pete looked at his screen one more time. Then he turned to his console and started working. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Roy Cole had been a monitoring station operator for 11 years, and in that time he had watched a lot of things on his screens. Asteroid tracking, commercial traffic logging, weather system monitoring for the upper atmosphere, the routine background activity of a colony, world going about its business in a corner of the galaxy that did not see much excitement. He had taken a job because it paid reliably and the hours were predictable, and he was good at the particular kind of sustained attention that watching screens for long periods required. Some people found it tedious. Roy found it comfortable. He liked knowing what was out there. He liked having the screens tell him the shape of the space around the world. He lived on. He had never watched anything like this. The Vorkin fleet had appeared on his long-range sensors 11 days ago as a cluster of contacts at the edge of Sector 7, far enough away that the readings were fuzzy at first, resolving slowly into sharper detail as the days passed and the distance closed. He had filed his first report on day 1 and had been filing reports every 6 hours since then as the fleet moved steadily and unhurriedly toward the colony worlds with the deliberate patience of something that knew where it was going and was not worried about what it would find when it got there. The colony's defense council had received his reports and had held meetings and had produced the responses that small colony defense councils produce when facing a situation that is beyond their realistic capacity to address. They had sent communications to the assembly. They had requested assistance through official channels. They had reviewed their own limited defense assets and reached the honest conclusion that those assets were not relevant to the scale of what was coming toward them. They had talked. They had hoped. Roy had kept watching his screens and filing his reports because that was his job and because watching and reporting was the only contribution he could make to a situation that was going to resolve itself without reference to anything he did. At 0840 hours on the morning of the 61st day, since the fleet first appeared on his sensors, the Vorkin formation was 4 hours from weapons range of the nearest colony settlement. Roy had calculated this the previous evening and had written it at the top of his 0600 report and had then sat with that number for a while before going to bed and had not slept particularly well. He was at his station by 0730. He did not see any point in being anywhere else. He watched his screens. At 0840, the fleet was where his projections said it would be, moving on the same steady heading it had maintained for days. Formation intact, no deviations from the advance pattern. Roy logged the position update and filed it as part of his continuous tracking record and watched the projected intercept timeline count down on his secondary display. For hours. At 0841, his long-range sensors registered something new. Not the Vorkin fleet. Something else, coming from a completely different direction, from the heading that his navigation charts identified as toward Earth system. The contact was brief at first, a flash of sensor return that appeared, and then disappeared before his instruments could fully resolve it. The kind of reading that could be a calibration artifact or a natural phenomenon or something his equipment was not quite sensitive enough to characterize at this range. Roy leaned forward in his chair. He pulled up the raw sensor data and looked at it without the automated filtering that the monitoring software applied to eliminate noise. The raw data showed the contact more clearly. Not a calibration artifact. Not a natural phenomenon that matched anything in his reference database. Something had been there at 0841 and was not there at 0841 plus 15 seconds, and his instruments were telling him it had been significant but not telling him anything more specific than that. He switched his attention back to the Vorkin fleet. At 0842, the formation changed. This was the first time in 61 days of watching that the fleet had done anything other than advance on its established heading. Roy's eyes went immediately to the formation display, where the individual contacts that made up the Vorkin fleet were tracked as separate elements, and he watched the pattern of those contacts shift in a way that his monitoring software was flagging with uncertainty indicators, little yellow markers that appeared when the system was tracking something it could not confidently categorize. Not advancing, not retreating in the organized way that a fleet retreated when it was choosing to disengage and withdraw along a planned heading, just changing, the formation losing its coherent shape in a way that Roy's experience of watching traffic patterns and weather systems and orbital mechanics was telling him did not match any of the normal categories of how large organized things move through space. He watched. He did not file a report. He did not call his supervisor. He did not take his eyes off his screens or anything, because something was happening, and his 11 years of watching had given him a very reliable instinct for when something was actually happening, as distinct from when the screens were showing him normal activity that only looked significant because he had been staring at it for too long. Something was actually happening. The 22 minutes that followed were the strangest of Roy Cole's professional life, and he had spent 11 years in a job that was almost entirely devoid of strangeness. He watched the Vorkin fleet's contacts on his display. He watched them with the full focused attention of someone who understands that what they are seeing is important and that they will need to be able to describe it accurately afterward. He watched the formation continue its transformation from the organized geometric pattern it had maintained for 61 days into something that his tracking software was increasingly unable to follow and categorize. He watched sensor returns drop out, not all at once, not in a way that a mass equipment failure would cause them to drop out suddenly and uniformly across all arrays simultaneously. They dropped out in clusters and sequences, and his instruments were catching fragments of data between the dropouts that were technically there in his logs, but that he could not assemble into a coherent picture of what was physically happening in the space where the Vorkin fleet had been. At the 12-minute mark, he ran a full diagnostic on his sensor arrays because the readings had become so inconsistent with any framework he had for understanding sensor data that equipment failure felt like it had to be the explanation. The diagnostic came back clean. The arrays were functioning correctly. They were just picking up a situation that they were not built to characterize because they had been built to characterize normal things. And whatever was happening in the space where the Vorkin fleet was not a normal thing. He kept watching. At the 22-minute mark, he looked at his display. The contacts were gone. All of them. Not reduced. Not showing the partial returns of a fleet that had taken significant damage and was withdrawing with some vessels lost. The contact count had gone from a full Vorkin fleet strength that he had been tracking for 61 days to 0. Complete 0. Across every sensor array he had. At every range setting, on every detection frequency his equipment could use. He ran the sweep 3 times. 0 every time. He sat back in his chair. He looked at his display for a long time. Not a short time. A genuinely long time. The kind of time a person takes when they have looked at something and understood what it shows and are sitting with the gap between what they understand intellectually and what they can accept as real. Then he started writing his report. He wrote it the way he wrote every report, accurately and in the order that events had occurred, with the specific sensor readings attached and the timestamps logged and the diagnostic results included to demonstrate that his equipment had been functioning correctly throughout. He wrote it as a professional document representing 11 years of reliable monitoring work, and he wrote it honestly, because honest was the only way he knew how to write a report. His supervisor, Gail Marsh, called him 4 minutes after he filed it. "Roy." Her voice had the quality of someone who has read something and is trying to decide how to handle it. "I need you to rewrite this." Roy looked at his empty display where 61 days of Vorkin fleet contacts had been 40 minutes ago. "Why?" he asked. "Because what you wrote is not possible," Gail said. Roy understood what she meant. He had sat with the same problem himself for the long time he had spent looking at his screen before writing anything. The impossibility of it. The gap between what the sensors showed and what any reasonable framework for how things work could accommodate. "I know," he said. "I watched it happen." There was a pause on Gail's end. "Rewrite it anyway," she said finally. "See if you can find different language." Roy spent 20 minutes on the rewrite. He tried different framings and different technical descriptions and different ways of presenting the sensor data that might make the conclusion feel less impossible to whoever read it. When he finished, he read it back. It said the same thing. The Vorkin fleet had been present in Sector 7 at 0840 hours. At 0842 hours, its formation had begun to change in ways its equipment could not categorize. Over the following 22 minutes, all sensor contacts associated with the fleet had ceased. No debris field of any scale was detectable on any sensor array at any range. No distress signals had been received. No emergency transmissions of any kind. No evidence of withdrawal along any heading his instruments could track. The Vorkin fleet had been in Sector 7. 22 minutes later, it was not. All of it. He filed the rewrite and sat back in his chair and looked out the small window above his station at the ordinary sky of Reach, blue and clear and completely normal, and thought about 4 hours to weapons range and what that number meant now and did not mean now. The Defense Council would be meeting again this morning. He thought their meeting would go differently today. The news had moved through the galaxy the way significant news always moved, faster than official channels and ahead of any institutional attempt to manage it. Roy Cole's report had been filed to the Colony Monitoring Network and had reached the Assembly's General Information Relay within hours of his rewrite. It had not been classified or restricted because the Colony of Reach did not have the infrastructure to classify things quickly, and by the time anyone thought about whether restricting it might be advisable, it had already propagated through too many relay points to be pulled back. Within 18 hours of Roy sitting at a station watching empty screens where a fleet used to be, the core facts of his report were available to anyone in the Assembly's communication network who wanted to read them. Most people wanted to read them. The reaction across the galaxy was not uniform, and it was not simple, and it was not the kind of reaction that resolved itself quickly into a clear collective response. Different species process information differently based on their own histories and their own relationships with the Vorkin Empire, and their own understanding of what Earth was and was not. But underneath the variation, there was a common thread running through all of it. The thread of people who had held a picture how things were arranged and were now holding that picture up against new information and finding that the picture needed significant revision. The Vorkin Empire's Assembly communications had gone silent within 24 hours of Roy's report becoming public. Not officially silent. The Empire had not issued a formal statement withdrawing from Assembly communications or announcing any change in its diplomatic posture. The silence was the silence of an institution that had received information it did not know how to respond to and had defaulted to the oldest institutional response to that situation, saying nothing while it figured out what saying something should mean. The holding messages that came back when other species attempted contact said a response was being prepared. The response was not prepared on day 1. It was not prepared on day 2. It was not prepared on day 3. The Vorkin ambassador's seat in the Assembly chamber sat empty. Walter Greer arrived at the Assembly building at his usual time on the morning of the 3rd day after Roy Cole's report. He took the same route he always took, through the east entrance and down the main corridor and past the coffee station where the steward had been working for as long as Walter had been coming to this building. He walked at his usual pace, which was unhurried without being slow, the pace of someone who was where he was supposed to be and had no reason to adjust his speed in either direction. He was aware that people were looking at him, not staring. Nobody in the Assembly corridors was doing anything as obvious as staring. These were experienced political professionals who had spent careers learning to observe without appearing to observe, to gather information from their environment without broadcasting that they were doing it. But Walter had spent 8 years as Earth's senior delegate in this institution, and he had developed his own version of that skill, and he could read the texture of the attention in a corridor the way you read weather, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small indicators that together describe a condition. The attention was different this morning. It had been different since Roy Cole's report. He had felt it building over 3 days through the secure feed he monitored from Earth's Defense Command, and the pattern of communications coming in and out of the Assembly's various member delegations, in the meetings that were being requested, and the questions that were being asked through official and unofficial channels. He had tracked it the way he tracked everything, quietly and without drawing attention to the tracking. He walked into the chamber and took his seat. The notebook went on the desk. The pen came out of his jacket pocket. The steward appeared at his shoulder with a coffee, and Walter accepted it and nodded his thanks and settled into the familiar routine of a delegate preparing for a morning session. Around him the chamber filled. He did not count the empty seats in the Vorkin section across the chamber, but he was aware of him the way you are aware of a gap in a familiar pattern, the specific presence of an absence that changes the shape of a space you know well. Every other delegation was present, every one of them. Walter had noted this from his position. Full attendance on a morning when the agenda contained nothing of particular significance by normal assembly standards, no major votes scheduled, no contentious issues on the docket that would have driven attendance on their own merits. Full attendance because the thing that was driving attendance this morning was not on the agenda. It was sitting in the mid-left section of the chamber in a plain jacket with a notebook and a coffee, looking exactly as it had always looked, and every experienced political figure in the room was watching it and trying to revise their understanding of what it actually was. Young aide Carl Price had been assigned to Walter's staff 4 months earlier, fresh from his academic program. 23 years old and sharp, and still in the part of his career where he noticed everything, because he had not yet developed the selective attention that experience eventually installed. He was seated in the aide row behind Walter's desk, and he had been tracking the room since they arrived, and what he was tracking was making him quietly and persistently aware of something he was not sure how to process. He leaned forward slightly. "They're all looking at you," he said. His voice was low enough that only Walter could hear it. Walter did not look up from his notebook, where he had been writing the day's date, and a brief structural outline for the session. "I know," he said. Carl sat with this for a moment. "Does that bother you?" Walter set his pen down and considered the question with the genuine attention. He gave the questions that deserved genuine attention rather than reflexive answers. He looked at the page in front of him and thought about 8 years in this chamber and 30 years of Earth's membership, and all the sessions attended, and dues paid, and procedural votes filed, and unremarkable mornings that had accumulated into the context for this particular morning. "No," he said simply. He picked up his pen and returned to his notes. Carl sat back in his row and looked at the chamber around him, at the delegations in their sections doing professional work of appearing to be doing other things while actually watching the mid-left section, at the empty Vorkin seats across the room that were their own kind of statement, at the session chair preparing to call morning to order. He thought about what he knew and what he had not known 4 months ago when he arrived in this posting, and what the gap between those two things said about the nature of the work he was part of. The session chair called the chamber to order. The agenda was read in the standard format by the administrative secretary, each item given its procedural designation and estimated time allocation, the ordinary scaffolding of an ordinary assembly session. The first item was a trade route dispute between 2 mid-tier member species that had been on the docket for 6 weeks and was expected to take most of the morning. Normal, routine, the regular business of an institution that had been doing this for a very long time. Walter opened his notebook to the first clean page and wrote the date at the top in the small, precise handwriting he had used his whole career, and drew a line under it and began his notes for the session. The chamber proceeded around him with the accumulated weight of 3 days of silence from the Vorkin Empire, and Roy Cole's report still moving through the galaxy's communication networks, and every delegation in the room carrying in its collective awareness a revised picture of the quiet delegation in the mid-left section that had spent 30 years being entirely forgettable. On the surface, nothing looked different from any of the hundreds of sessions Walter had attended before this one. The notebook was the same notebook. The pen was the same pen. The coffee from the steward at the same time in the same cup. The unremarkable delegate in the unremarkable section of the chamber, doing the unremarkable work of attending and noting and participating in the procedural business of the day. Everything looked the same, and every experienced political figure in that room understood with a complete clarity that sometimes arrived slowly, and then all at once that everything was different. 30 years of quiet had never been unremarkable. It had always been this. They had simply not been paying attention.